All right, big show today. We're going to do the post-mortem of the Trevor Bauer to the Mets rumor. What went into the story? How close was it to happening? Did Bauer and his camp use the Mets? That's something Andy and I haven't really talked about yet. We'll discuss that. We'll go through what might be next, both in center field and for the rotation and at third base. Lots to discuss as the offseason is almost over. Next. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Shea Anything podcast. It's Doug Williams and Andy Martino with you for this episode. A reminder to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Also, we're coming off of the QBC weekend, and Andy and myself were involved in that. That was really fun. And I think it was a good promotion for Baseball Night in New York for any Mets fans who don't already watch the show. Four of us that have been involved in the show since its inception with Jim Buquette and Sal, as well as us two. And look, we've had a lot to discuss the past couple of months, some very serious topics, some ridiculousness as always for us. And we have a lot of fun with it. So as the rest of the offseason progresses, as we get closer and closer to spring training, please check out the show weeknights at 6 o'clock on SNY. So Andy, we're coming off of the Bauer story. How much reporting have you done on it since he chose the Dodgers? Like, after the fact, and how much have you learned since then?
Yeah, a lot. I'd say since we were on the air Friday talking about it, there's always that fallout, talking to the people once the air is coming out of the balloon with a situation like that. Some post-mortem, like you said. Let's see, what have I learned since that happened? Back on Friday, I learned that the Mets had offered Bauer $105 million. He signed for 103 with the Dodgers. We learned a little bit about the process, which I gathered from reporting on it but that the Mets really hadn't heard anything from Bauer until they got a call around 2 o'clock on Friday that he's going to the Dodgers. They thought they had a pretty good shot, but just like the rest of us, everyone associated with the Mets went to bed on Thursday night not knowing, waiting to hear from Bauer. Bauer completely controlled the timing at that point. So they took the shot and they were hoping that it would go in, but it kind of definitely was on the rim, sort of circling, and then it just didn't go in. And that's what happened. They obviously made the aggressive push. What else? I guess to the luxury tax point with Bauer, which was something that we talked about a lot. Like, as you know, the Mets were not interested in going over the $210 million luxury tax for most of the winter. I learned that Alderson went to Steve Cohen and pitched Bauer at a certain point as a reason to potentially go over the luxury tax specifically. So not getting Bauer doesn't mean anything about it means that they'll probably go back to their old strategy. He was like a guy who seemed maybe worth making an exception for, basically. So there's that. And there's the fact that I think that even people involved with the Mets that wanted this to happen or were pursuing it to happen probably were disappointed when they first got the call, and then also probably understood the bullets that they dodged with potential controversy going forward. And the fact he doesn't have a super long track record of success, and the fact that signing him makes it harder to do other things. And there's a lot of reasons why this was ultimately felt okay, I think, for the Mets.
And one thing that, because we discussed pretty much everything you just mentioned during the QBC on Saturday, but one thing that we didn't get really specific on was, have you gotten the sense that since the Mets lost out on him, even with more money total in their offer, do the Mets think that they were being used, or do they think that they were seriously considered by Bauer and his camp?
I think they do. I think that they were seriously considered. I mean, Alderson's had to be careful of that all offseason about the perception that Steve Cohen's Mets are going to be in on everybody. So agents have used the Mets. It definitely happened in the case of DJ LeMahieu. There was talk about the Mets and LeMahieu, and it wasn't real at all. But every agent wants their player linked to the Mets right now. So yeah, it's a fair question. I get the sense that they felt like they were mostly dealing in good faith. Bauer's agent's a guy named John Fedorov, who was very deep down the line with Alderson and the Mets and the negotiations, and they got into contract talks that were very specific. So it wasn't a case where there were just leaks that he was linked with the Mets. They really were working out a contract with the Mets, Fedorov and Alderson, and then the Mets, just general contract people were down the road on that. So I don't think it was a bluff. No.
That's interesting that I'm hearing a different name than Rachel Luba, because she's kind of publicly his agent. Does he just have a team of agents in reality that negotiate with teams?
He has Rachel Luba and John Fedorov, who my understanding was the one negotiating with the teams for the most part.
Do you think, and I know you've injected a little bit of your opinion on Twitter and also in your columns for SNY.TV, do you think that beyond just the fact that they're not going to be paying this large amount of money to Trevor Bauer, as a team, there's an argument to be made that they're better off without him?
You mean in terms of on the field or off the field, or just the whole mix?
I think for the sake of this conversation, let's exclusively talk on the field.
On the field, no, look, they're better this next year with him. I mean, let's be real. He's really good. He's not Garrett Cole, and he's not Steven Strasburg in terms of track record. And they misread his market at first by looking for those kinds of contracts. But he's good. Who would you rather have as a number 2 starter, Marcus Stroman or Trevor Bauer? It would have been nice in terms of the Mets trying to win the World Series this coming year. But in the big picture, look, we didn't really think about this during the process because we were focused on Bauer, but the entire Mets rotation is basically about to go away as far as team control. Like Stroman, free agent, no draft pick compensation because he already took the qualifying offer. He can't have a draft pick the second time. So Stroman's just a free agent. Syndergaard's a free agent. DeGrom's got an opt-out after next year. And if you'd sign Bauer with an opt-out after this year, you're looking at like the whole rotation's basically not under control after this year and then into next. So they have decisions to make. Do we re-up DeGrom? I can't believe we're talking about that question again, but here we are. They have a decision to make about Syndergaard, a decision to make about Stroman. So those things become easier without Bauer on board, making record money in the short term, at least. So that's good. I don't think they're going to do anything earth-shattering right now with the money that they didn't end up spending on Bauer. So, look, I guess the 2021 Mets are probably a little worse off on the field for not having Bauer. But there's so much that comes with Trevor Bauer that I think it was good, ultimately maybe good for the franchise that it didn't work out, big picture.
Yeah, that's the nuance to the conversation that I think is interesting. So in your answer, you arrive at the conclusion that 2021 Mets better with Bauer than without, which I think to any listener right now is obvious. However, as you go through it, you realize there's a couple aspects of that answer. First, that moving forward, you might have Syndergaard or Stroman, who, if the Mets want to keep any of them longer than just beyond this year, the chances are better now that that's the case without Bauer under contract. And also just the idea that, it keeps you flexible financially and you potentially are better going forward without him. The problem, though, is there's no earth-shattering move left to be made. It's not like on the free agent market right now that Springer's left or anyone else that Mets fans can pivot to. So it's a tough sell for 2021. It's a much easier sell moving forward, but there's no fan Twitter pivot that's like that super easy. And the one you could make is Jackie Bradley Jr. And so I think some fans did. Then they wake up to the news potentially on Sunday that they've apparently agreed to a deal with Albert Almora Jr. So is that dream over that you get the...
It was never... It was... The Bradley thing was like... In some ways, this has not been the best offseason for my business because, Your as a reader, your perception of whether the Mets are in on Bradley basically depends on whether your reporter is getting their information from one side or the other. I mean, I try to talk to everyone. I know other people do as well, but Sunday was not good. It's like Mets are in on Bradley. The Mets are not in on Bradley. Da, da, da. It's like if you're reading, you're just like, I'm going to unfollow all these people because I don't know what's going on. So I'm sympathetic to that. The facts on Jackie Bradley Jr. Look, Doug, we've talked. Nothing's changed. We've talked about this. They were likely to go with a backup, a guy like Almora or Marisnik. How many times have we talked about Albert Almora? Way more times than Jackie Bradley Jr. So they're just Mets are just staying the course here, and tough tacos if people out there thought there was a Bradley thing. They thought there was an Arenado thing too, but there wasn't. What can I say? It's not the fan pivot thing. Like it's intense sometimes, and it's so counter to building a good baseball team. Like, oh, we didn't get Brad Hand. Brad was the name that we wanted, and Sandy Alderson's a failure because he didn't get Brad Hand. And it's like, whatever, Aaron Loop's good. And I sense the same thing with like the Almora Bradley thing. Like these decisions obviously don't happen in a vacuum. They're thinking of the whole roster, the whole budget, Obviously, and this is not just logic, but what I'm told is if the Mets had known that they're going to have a DH, they might have pursued Bradley. But they don't. Like they can't sign him right now, but they don't want to sign him right now and marginalize either Nimmo or Smith. They feel like they get better defensively and worse offensively by making that move. Plus, just financially, the Mets reached out once a while back to Scott Boras with a 2-year, not offer, but like 2-year concept about Bradley and didn't even get an answer. Boras didn't even answer. It was so far from what he wanted to do.
Left them on red.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah. So it just was never Jackie Bradley Jr. is more likely to play center field for the Mets than Gary Apple is, but Albert Almora was always pretty much the guy.
Well, you always have the option of like Almora is not the level of player that financially or roster-wise keeps you out of the market for another center fielder. He's a very much below average offensive player who you're not going to pay a ton of money to. If, let's say, a couple weeks go by and we finally, the night before Christmas, the night before the spring training actually starts, we learn that there's been an agreement on the DH and that the National League will have it, and Jackie Bradley Jr. is for some reason still unsigned, the Mets can go back to him. But I think the pivot conversation is interesting in this context because it is the only reason the answer to are the Mets better off in 2021 without Bauer isn't so obvious, which is like, if they were to pivot to somebody else great or had the ability to, then you could make the argument, yeah, the Mets could still be great in 2021 without Bauer, which they can be. But, I think the average thinker is like, well, why not sign someone else for that money? Why not go out now and get Chris Bryant? So that's why it's interesting. And real apologies to our producer, Jeff, because I have now, he had so many well-organized segments in our rundown, and I just jumped past a couple to talk about Almora and Bradley.
Talk about disrespecting someone's work. He really spent a lot of time on
that. So he wants to do now rapid fire starting pitcher options. And he told me straight up, just list the name, get an answer, list another name. Okay, let's go through them. So what might be next in the rotation without Bauer? Jake Odorizzi, Andy?
No.
James Paxton?
No.
Jake Arrieta?
Maybe.
Care to expand on that one? I'll give you the time to expand on that one.
The Mets went to a showcase that he held, I guess, like a week ago. Liked what they saw enough where they have some interest in the player. That's what I got.
What about Taijuan Walker?
No.
Rich Hill?
Maybe.
Okay. That one less exciting, but if he gives you 15 starts in 2021, he's almost always good when he pitches. The type of warm body you need that every baseball team needs to form a big league rotation. So
look, they're going to sign some pitchers still. The way I described it in that article that we published today was like, this is the stage of the offseason where as a reporter, I don't spend too much time on individual names. Sometimes you hear things like the Mets are not interested in Odorizzi. Okay, got it. Like I know that, so I share that with our readers and our listeners. But basically, it's like you got like 1 year offers out to like probably a bunch of these guys, and then one of them's going to take one, and then that'll be the guy. It's sort of like that stage of depth. It's same thing with bench. It's like, ooh, the Mets are interested in Marwin Gonzalez. It's like, yeah, okay, some other guys, and we'll see. That's like, it's February 8th. That's kind of where we're at with the remaining free agent guys.
Yeah. All right, let's move to designated Twitter. See, that's the name of a segment we do on this show. Segments are good for podcasts as we continue to move forward through this episode. So we're talking about Trevor Bauer's explanation, long one, which involved him ending up donating to charities as kind of an apology for it. It was a long apology to Mets fans because of the glitch on his website during the hysteria on Friday. A bunch of signed hats went up on his website. Now, any Met fan listening to this podcast, I'm going to guess, was in their foxhole with me and people in the media, but also super fans that were like, what does all of this mean? And at one point, there was a Bauer hat. And if you bought the Bauer hat and it had the hashtag LFGM next to it, it came with a caption that was like, I can't wait to take them out in New York. I think it was the hat. It might have been a t-shirt. I don't know.
Yeah.
So he was he's saying, I wasn't on Twitter, I wasn't online, but my team from my website had these things up that they were workshopping. I didn't honestly read his statement on Twitter that closely because I think there's a significant lack of caring on my end at this point. However,
which is healthy.
Is healthy. Did you think that was at all a representation of Bauer that happened? Did you think that was trolling? What did you read into it?
I was a classier tweet than what he often does. I don't say usually. Trevor Bauer, let me back up. The world would be a better place if Trevor Bauer were offline permanently. The world would be a better place if we were offline permanently, but Trevor Bauer is even worse than we are. It's just all a bunch of blah, blah, blah. It's so annoying. Not just him, although he's pretty bad. The accusation or feeling of harassment by a college student that was raised with Bauer was one thing, but his Twitter's got some ugly stuff on it in the past. There's one where he was appeared to be flirting with birtherism. Was not born in the country, and there's a lot of stuff that would have come up with his social media. And then more recently, it was long-winded YouTube videos and about what am I going to do? What's my decision? And okay, LeBron, now we got a tweet thread about your marketing team. These are the kinds of things that I'm glad that we don't have to pay much more attention to. Let's leave it at that.
I guess my commentary, and I in some ways, I don't want to pile on him because it's just not really my place, or I don't know. But there is part of me that is he gets applauded as kind of the savvy social media guy in baseball, right? Because we kill Mike Trout for not having a brand and not working on his brand and not doing enough to promote that he's the best player in baseball in the face of the sport. So if we kill Trout for that, we can't kill Bauer for doing the best he can with a website and YouTube and Twitter. But at the same time, I'm is this really the best we can do as a sport? This is the guy. They're Fernando Tatis Jr., for example, is bat flipping on the cover of the show. That's the best we can do.
I don't think, Doug, that social media is the place for players to ideally market themselves to a younger generation. I think we both know, I think the Twitter crowd's probably going the way of the Facebook crowd, old and toxic. And it's just not for Francisco. What Fernando Tatis does on the field is electric, and being in MLB The Show is great and all that. I don't think he's a big Twitter presence, if any, right? So I just don't think that's. I think social media is for athletes is very a couple of years ago, and baseball's just behind on everything. And Bauer's sort of gotten some credibility for this, but fortunately, the backlash also came where people were like, "All right, he's online, but what's he actually doing? And is it toxic or is it good?" in baseball, it's a very low bar for celebrity and engaging and stuff like that. But there's been plenty of people that have pointed out. I'd say it's at least 50-50. There's been a lot written about Trevor Bauer is not the guy that we should be looking to for this stuff. Already in LA, there's columns being written like, "What a damn shame that the Dodgers did this. They could win anyway without this toxic guy." That's been a take in LA already. So he's not like universally like held up as the example of how to engage. I think, Doug, half the people think he's an example of how not to do it.
Right. And I think I got some tweets on Friday that were like, interesting that because I've been vocal about Bauer and how I thought he just made no sense from every perspective for the Mets, especially from a PR standpoint and frankly an HR standpoint. But I got some tweets that were like, it's interesting that we're all talking about the money and the contract and his website and not talking about what we would have been talking about had he signed with the Mets. That it was the first story wasn't like, I cannot believe the Dodgers did this. Mm-hmm. It was, and to a certain point, I get that because I think him signing with the Mets was so specific to what the Mets have been through in this offseason. I knew he was going to get a job. I was never advocating that Trevor Bauer should not be employed anywhere. It was just a weird fit with a team that's had these issues with Porter and Callaway in its past. So I just think that was an interesting conversation, thinking how much of a national story should this be now that a team that just won the World Series that hasn't had the Porter and Callaway story just signed him. And it's interesting to hear that you've been reading in LA and the Los Angeles sports media that people are noticing his history and what the signing might mean for their team moving forward. I don't know. I think it's an interesting point that you make also, how connected social media is to a brand. Like you're right. I don't know if I've ever come across Fernando Tatis Jr. on Twitter, but I know that he's probably the face of Major League Baseball right now. And he's done that without going live on YouTube 10 times a day or whatever.
Exactly. Because he doesn't. Exactly. I think, unfortunately, I think we've watched those social platforms devolve over the last couple of years into not being that much fun for the user anymore. And so that's probably not the place an athlete should go to market themselves. That's a little far afield from our Mets conversation, but I think it relates to Bauer in a way. I think he's a little behind the trend on what's cool. Although in some ways, I tried to stay open-minded to it because his YouTube presence is a lot like my young son who like to watch these like Minecraft YouTubers. Bauer's style is all like that, like the way that the graphics are and the tone. Like it's like definitely of a thing that maybe the typical baseball consumer doesn't natively understand. So I try to think, well, maybe it's just a thing. But again, it's just there's a lot of social media allows for a lot of self-indulgence. I've been guilty of it at times. I try to scale it back as much as possible. I don't know if anyone's telling Trevor Bauer to scale it back because he's posting these long videos about, I want to be part of the front office and I want to pitch every fourth day. And it's like, okay, it's just a little exhausting for people, I think.
Okay, so next segment is 3-batter rule, and I've already obliterated this. Jeff had an interesting idea. It was a center field 3-batter rule with Albert Almora, Jackie Bradley Jr. And the third one is still interesting. We haven't discussed it. So just for our listeners, this was going to be a good segment. But the third one is Ken Griffey Jr. He was hired to kind of be alongside Rob Manfred, and really interesting hire. If there's anybody that can kind of make baseball cool again, even in retirement, it's him. Do you think that was a hire for him to like get to work and help the sport? Or do you think that was a savvy PR move by Major League Baseball to get like the coolest guy to ever play the sport to be involved in the like potential labor negotiations moving forward?
I think the Raul Ibanez hire is much more significant for the sport. Griffey, like they've had guys attached to the commissioner's office, and now it's like Theo Epstein and Griffey, who I don't believe post-pandemic will be, reporting to the office every day at 9:15 for the morning staff meeting with Commissioner Manfred. It's like, it's a little bit more probably consulting and things like that. It's great that you can have someone with Griffey's stature on board, of course. But like the day-to-day stuff, the player perspective that they missed with Chris Young being gone with the Texas Rangers, is going to Raul Ibanez, who is as beloved and like kind and intelligent of a person as you're ever going to find in the game of baseball. So that was just an unbelievable hire for MLB. So that be my answer. Griffey's great, but Ibanez is going to be that was just a home run of a hire for them.
So in terms of what's next, Andy, back to the Mets conversation, you just wrote for SNY.TV a guide for what to expect this week from the Mets. And that it's going to be a busy week. And I think that's kind of the point, is just because the big names are off the board doesn't mean we're done covering some potential additions. So let's go through third base, then more bullpen, more bench. Start at third. Is JD Davis, you think, viewed by Sandy Alderson and the rest of the front office as their starting third baseman?
Definitely. They haven't been linked to any third baseman other than JD Davis this offseason that I can recall. I mean, like in reality, there's been fan fiction written about other things and agent-driven stuff and whatever. But it's not. I mean, look, he's JD Davis. It's not like it's not like David Wright's our third baseman because it's 2010. Something else better could come along. But what they like about Davis is that he's a pretty good player. And also they gave up, this is key, they gave up, I think, 11 years of team control with Andres Jimenez and Ahmed Rosario, and Davis is a controllable guy. So that is a good reason to keep him around. And again, he's a decent offensive player. So probably him.
Yeah. And again, just a reminder that these conversations we have, especially even before spring training, about like, is so-and-so your starting third baseman? Like JD Davis could get cold in April and Luis Guillorme could be hitting 400
right.
like he was for a period of time last year. And then suddenly like Jeff McNeil's starting at third base 3 or 4 times a week and Guillorme's playing second.
Good point. Or Marwin Gonzalez could end up your third baseman if you bring him in for the bench.
Right. And so all of those things are fluid. So let's go to the bench next, actually, because you mentioned Marwin Gonzalez. I know you don't get specifics about names too much when we're talking about that level of player, but now that like Keith Hernandez is signed elsewhere and that, Marwin Gonzalez has been a good player in the past, especially in an Astros uniform. Do you think that that's a player the Mets really like?
I can tell. My reporting is they like him in a group of other guys. And if there's a lot of other interest, they're probably not going to like go crazy for that particular player, but it could work out.
Okay. And as for the bullpen, I mean, look, as of right now, at least in my opinion, I think they have a potentially very good bullpen. Mm-hmm. And I brought this up with Keith because I know he gets so frustrated watching relievers come into games and just like stall the game by losing the plate. And they have so many guys who can do that. Unfortunately, but potentially fortunately, because they can also be very good. Like Jerry's Familia can walk the ballpark, as can Miguel Castro, as can Edwin Diaz, as can Dellin Betances. That's 4 guys in your bullpen with potentially elite stuff who can be really volatile up and down. The good news is that Aaron Loop is pretty steady. He's been in the big leagues a long time. Trevor May is potentially a high-level reliever that you just brought in. There's going to be some steady presences there, but are they looking for one more?
Yes. Just looking for more pitching, starting, relieving, whatever. Definitely still looking for pitching. So, no one of the high-end variety like the guys you just named probably. But yeah, they'd like to bolster that pitching staff any which way they can, for sure.
Do you have any names at this stage, though, for a fan out there who might want to know?
Honestly, you just go to Trade Rumors, look at the remaining free agents. Probably a right-hander at this point. They were determined to find a lefty. They found one with Loop after they didn't get Brad Hand. It's just a matter of I bet you they have 1 year or minor league offers with invites out to a whole bunch of people on that list of still remaining available guys. So what it takes is the agent to be like, call up Sandy and be like, okay, can we do a deal on Rich Hill? Yeah. Okay, great. Good. Got an agreement. That it's just, we'll see how it plays out this week. I'm not trying to be evasive. I don't use a ton of my time trying to figure out, like, I used a ton of my time trying to figure out, are you interested in Bauer, Springer, or Real Muto? But at this stage of things, it's a little bit more interchangeable. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I haven't checked, but I don't think I'm on the MLB trade rumors list of available right-handed free agents, but I think I should be.
You're not a free agent. You're under contract.
I think for the sake of what's best for SNY, I think they'd let me pitch and do my job if possible. Like,
well, you know, Blevins set a precedent, actually, that you would be able to follow up with and say if Jerry could do it.
Right. I'll host Baseball Night New York on day games or off days. I do some weekend sports nights potentially. If there's a 1 p.m. game, I'll host the 11 o'clock.
You have pretty good command of your sinker, is that right?
Yeah, pretty good command. Velocity not there, and you know, my workouts are pretty exclusive to riding the Peloton. I'm not sure how much that helps pitching, but look. Yeah. I'll get in touch with MLB trade rumors and see if I can get myself on that.
List.
All right, Andy. Well, again, busy week, and don't tie yourself out with the Rich Hills of the world. I totally understand that. You've done enough hard work on the big name free agents, none of which the Mets signed. But let's remember, everybody, Goose Fraba, they traded for Francisco Lindor and Carlos Carrasco.
They did.
And
can we close?
And they signed James McCann, and they signed Trevor May.
Look, no one out there would probably accuse me of being too positive on the Mets, generally speaking. But this is a really good team. They've had a hell of an offseason, and they got one of the big fish, and that guy being Lindor. They're in a good place. They've built up their baseball ops staff. They have Sandy Alderson at the helm. They have an owner with resources and a bunch of new, really good players. I am personally very interested to see how the Mets play this year because I think that they have had an amazing offseason and have a really good team. They'll be contending for the NL East, and it's a great year one for a new regime. Again, we say this over and over again, but it took the Dodgers about 7 years to win a World Series with their well-resourced, intelligent leadership. And for year one, I think the Alderson Cohen Mets have on the field, on the roster, have done tremendously. The offseason has been much more messy in terms of the Porter and Callaway stuff than obviously anyone would have liked. But I think that they've really done a nice job building a team. And the reaction/outrage cycle about not getting Brad Hand or something doesn't really match up with how well they've done building a team. That's my soapbox.
I think it's a perfectly rational soapbox to be on. And look, we'll see if they're done, but there's also guys on this roster already that Mets fans may not be fully aware of that are potentially going to be really important. Like we just made so much of Albert Almora Jr. for months. Malik Smith is on the Mets roster, who, if he played every day, would steal 70 bases, can catch pretty much anything in center field. Like, they're going to have like a pretty full, deep roster, at least in my opinion. Maybe they need one more starter and one more reliever. They'll get that. So the only problem is the NL East is going to be stacked, which is going to be really fun, but a really hard division to win. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. As always, please subscribe, rate, and review to the Shea Anything podcast. If you can, we'll be back with you next week.